up in BC. I moved to Calgary in the early 2000s. I worked in the oil and gas industry as a geologist. Everybody knows how that ended. And so I decided, I've been buying beef from Phil and Bet since they started their grass-fed, grass-finished program. And I was fortunate enough where I could sort of follow a passion of mine, which has always been cooking and sustainable foods. And you know, so I graduated from the SAIT Butchery and Charcuterie Management Program, and now I'm working with Phil and Bet to kind of help their clients get the most out of their product. So one of the challenges that I always had with previous producers, and we've been buying sides of beef since before we even knew Phil and Bet from other producers. You would get the problem we had was you get a box of beef, you'd have the label on it, and you had, some of them you didn't really know what to do with. Everybody knows what to do with a ribeye or a strip loin or a T-bone or a tenderloin, but you know, what do you do with a round steak? What do you do with a sirloin tip roast? And so, you know, the internet is a great resource in some ways, but you know, 14 pages through your Google search, you know, you're usually left with more questions than you have answers, which is why I'm stunned that Google brought you here, because Google generally doesn't take me anywhere. All it takes me down to some rabbit hole, and then I end up watching like animals fighting each other in the forest.
How many farms I looked at.
But yeah, and that's great, because you know, from all of the beef that we've had, that we've eaten since we moved here, Phil and Bet have been giving us the best product that we've had. And it seems every year it's getting better and better. The rotational grazing has made a huge difference in the quality of the meat. You know, last year when I was cutting meat for them, you know, they generally don't grade their meat, because grading itself, the way grading works is, in order for an animal to receive, say, a grade of AA, every box in that list has to be ticked as a AA. So that includes the shape of the cows, whether there's any injuries on the cows, the amount of subcutaneous fat, a bunch of other the color of the meat. And the only thing that grass-finished beef would never really hit was marble. So you would have a AAA rating on everything, except marbling was generally lower, because these animals are not getting pumped full of corn at the end of their life, so they're not getting fattened up. Last year's harvest was actually probably could have been graded a AA or higher on some of their cows. So it was a huge surprise for me. For cutting into it, from what I was expecting, a very lean piece of meat, it had a very tremendous amount of marbling for grass-finished beef. So that was very exciting. And then the product itself, the flavor and the texture of the product really showed, you know, how much better the
grass last year was spectacular. There was a lot of rain, and
yeah.
So there was a lot of grass. And so our animals were heavy, and they had a lot of fat, which was good.
Yeah.
And this year's shaping up the same.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, we're very happy that you've chosen to buy from them, because you know, and like, I believe this is the best beef you're going to find. You know, I've never been a big fan of grocery store beef. I've eaten a ton of it, but you know, at the end of the day, you get that dinner size, you know, ribeye steak, and it just never really felt satisfying. It always felt like it needed some help to it. And you know, with the beef that I get from Phil and Bet, it's salt and pepper and fire are the only things that I cook, you know, with my steaks with right now, and I absolutely love it. So what I can do now is just go through the cut sheet with you guys here. So it's broken down from the front quarter and hind quarter of the animal. The front quarter, the primals are basically the chuck and the rib are the main ones, and then the brisket. And on the hind quarter, it's the hip, which contains all your round cuts, and then your rib and your sirloin. Or sorry, your loin and your sirloin are on the hind quarters. So for roast weight, what we generally recommend is a pound of raw product per person. So if there's 2 of you eating, a 2-pound roast will you'll have water loss as it cooks, and that'll give you a healthy meal and maybe a little bit of leftovers for the day. I know the processors prefer a 4-pound roast, just for ease of cutting for them. But if I have a family of 3, my wife and my 12-year-old who still eats like a bird, and so a 4-pound roast would last us. We'd have leftovers for 8 days after that. So when I would order for us, I would order 2-pound roasts, and again that gives us dinner, and then roast beef sandwiches the next day, kind of thing.
Dion,
Yeah.
is there a difference with cooking a smaller roast to a bigger one? Or
No,
do you
not
cook it
really.
the same?
It's the cooking is more dependent on where the cut is from on the animal versus the size of it. Obviously, if you've got a bigger piece of meat, it's going to take longer for the heat to penetrate. But the cooking style itself, whether it's a dry cooking heat, like a dry roast, or whether you're braising something in a liquid, or barbecuing, like grilling something or smoking something, is more dependent on where the cut is from, as opposed to the size of it. So the only thing that would be different would be the time, and that's basic thermodynamics. A bigger piece of meat is going to take longer to heat through. So for the ground beef, they generally will make it lean. They're lean. What I got from the processors was a little bit fatty for me, so I'm going to be ordering mine extra lean. But I prefer my ground beef to be quite lean. So everybody's got a different opinion on it. The beef that I order, there isn't a restaurant in the world that would serve it, because they would consider it crazy to serve ground beef that has like an 8% fat content as opposed to a 12 or 20% fat content. But that's just me. So like I mentioned before, I like to add things into my beef. I like to chop bacon up into my hamburgers and grill them up. And so when you're starting with 20% beef, adding 20% bacon to that, kind of my wife tends to kind of look at me funny when I do that. So you get a few flare-ups, and then it's like, are you sure? That's a lot of bacon in there. So they come in 1-pound packs. So whatever, lean is the standard, like I said, but you can order medium, you can order regular, which is I think up to 30% fat. That's when you see the regular in the grocery store, it's like that light pink color. It doesn't even really look like beef anymore. There's a lot of fat in that. So I'd stick with lean for this year, and if you're not happy with it, next time around, you can adjust your preferences. Stewing meat, get it if you make stews. If you make chilies with cube meat, if you make beef barley soup, anything like that. What makes stew meat different from other parts of the animal is the stew meat is generally pieces of meat that have a lot of connective tissue in them. So it's meat off the shank or meat off the chuck, something that's got a decent amount of fat, and that connective tissue breaks down with the cooking process. So I'm sure everybody's had a piece of meat that's very tender but very dry, and that's usually from a cut that doesn't have any doesn't have a lot of connective tissue, doesn't have a lot of collagen in it. And so what happens is that collagen there's not enough to break down into gelatin, which is that wonderful, soft, moist, juicy flavor that you get from a very, very tender, well-cooked piece of meat. So if you do like stew meat, there is a difference between stew meat and just chopping up a round roast or something. So I would get that. Short ribs, probably my favorite braising cut. I dare say I would prefer short ribs over brisket, which a lot of people look at me funny, but I love short ribs. Braising or smoking are absolutely incredible. The marbling in them and the connective tissue in them, they just break down to such an amazing texture when you're eating them. So you can get them either split into individual pieces. I usually order a full plate. Like I buy a whole side of beef, so I get a full plate of short ribs, and then I either butcher them up myself, or I just throw the whole plate on the smoker. and then serve it up, have a bunch of friends over and serve up the massive dinosaur.
Shake hands.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So impressive too. Shank steaks, same sort of thing. A lot of connective tissue in there, so it's a great braising cut. We have long, cold winters here, so I braise a lot of meat. And so these are those cuts that, you put them on at 10 in the morning, you put them in the oven at 275, and you go out and run your errands, and you come home, and your house just smells like dinner. So yeah, shank steaks are a great one, a great piece of meat for braising. Prime rib roast, bone in or out. I like my prime ribs bone out. The heat travels at a slower temperature through bone than it does through meat. So if you have a piece of meat that has bones on one side, you're not going to get an even cook on that. So your meat up against the bone are going to be very rare. The outside part on the opposite side of the bone is going to be very well done. So I generally order all of my roasts boneless because I prefer a nice even cook throughout. And rib bones are great smoked or braised. They're not great grilled because they're really, really tough. There's a lot of connective tissue in there. You're not going to get that really, you're not going to get the best use out of those bones. So you can also order the back rib bones as well. So it's the exact same cut as your baby back pork ribs. Treat them the same way. Slow roast, braise them, or on the smoker. Amazing cut. Again, it's a very impressive, animalistic meal to have a huge back rib. Rib steaks. So this is where you have to start making decisions. So your rib steaks come from your rib roast. So you either get a ribeye steak or you get a prime rib roast. You can't really get both, right? Because all you're doing for your ribeye steaks is cutting that rib roast into steaks. So you have to make the decision which one are you going to be, getting the most use out of. If you want that impressive Christmas prime rib roast with the bones in, by all means. I'm not here to tell you don't do something if you like to do it, right? I'm just going to give you sort of what I do with my meat. But yeah, I mean that bone-in prime rib roast is a very impressive piece of meat. Steaks, I always get my steaks boneless. Same reason I mentioned before, more even cooking, and it's for me it's the ease of eating. By the time that piece of meat is ready, I don't really want to fight with the bone to get the meat off. I want to get that meat on my fork and in my belly
Then you
as
can't
fast
pick up
as
the bone
possible.
and chew the meat off.
Yeah, I know, but like I said before, usually, if the bones aren't cooked properly, it's a tough. You're really flossing after that one. So the chuck roast. So the chuck is the main front shoulder part of the cow. Generally thought of as a very tough cut. And generally is very tough, but there are some steaks that come off of the chuck that are incredibly nice. The first one, my favorite, or my wife's favorite, I should say, is the flat iron. So the flat, you've heard of it. The flat iron is actually a piece of meat that's attached to the inside of the shoulder blade. So where the T is on that shoulder blade, on one side of that is the flat iron steak. Beautiful, beautiful piece of meat. This is the third most tender piece of meat on the animal, which is funny because it comes out of the chuck, which nobody really thinks of as a tender part of the animal. There's another steak that comes off of there called the Delmonico. Delmonico, you may have heard of it. What it is so when the rib, when they're splitting the carcass into primals, they cut between the third and fourth rib, and that's what separates the chuck part of the primal from the rib part of the primal. Those muscles in the rib part are your ribeye. Well, those muscles don't end at the third rib. They continue on into the chuck, but because it's not part of the rib, it can't be called a ribeye, or it can't be called a rib steak. So they sometimes call them chuck eye, or the fancy name is the Delmonico. It's essentially, you get 3 ribeyes cut off your chuck. You're usually saving $3-4 a pound. If you see them at the butcher shop, you know, they're going to be significantly less expensive than a ribeye. It's going to be the exact same muscle group with the exact same features on it. Another one, another favorite of mine that comes off the chuck is the Denver steak. In Canada, we're trying to call it the Montreal steak. The non-fancy term is the chuck flap, which is not a very fancy term, which I can understand why they renamed it. It's a very, very nicely marbled, you know, moderately tender piece of meat. Makes wonderful steaks. It's not as tender as a tenderloin or as the ribeye, but it's definitely steak quality tender. It's definitely grillable, you know, eat it up rare, medium rare. Amazing piece of meat. Wonderful marbling in it, and that's, again, where you're getting a lot of your accessory flavors coming into your meat. So for the rest of the chuck is basically going to be roasts. And your chuck roasts are your long, slow pot roasts. You know, you cook them up to 205 degrees Fahrenheit. You break down all that connective tissue. You get that very nice, moist, tender piece of meat. You know, I know there's some places that'll throw their chucks on the smoker and cook them like a brisket. And you get that same, there's enough connective tissue where you have that same sort of unctuous, soft, you know, melt in your mouth sort of texture with the beef, with the chucks. So chuck roast I'm a big fan of. Again, you know, our 9.5-month winters we have here I do a lot of braising in the winter. My smoker runs almost non-stop through the summer, but that's only about 6 weeks sometimes. So yeah, so chuck ground. Some people like to grind up their chuck and have it separate. The chuck is essentially your 80-20 meat to fat ratio. A good butcher can make you a 20% ratio on your beef without having to separate your chuck on it. I don't grind it separately. I prefer my chuck as roasts. So I like to take the steaks off that I can eat, and then I just like the roasts. I don't do it separately. If you want your chuck ground separately, again, by all means. Cross rib roast, again, another piece off the front of the animal, another long cooking, sort of low and slow type of cut. Again, very good. Cross ribs are my favorite for like a beef dip, a Baron beef style beef on a bun. You know, with I sear off the outside. I throw, you know, chop up an onion in there, pour a can of beer in, put the lid on, put it in the oven, and then just leave it for the day. And then at the end, you slice it up. You got your jus at the bottom, strain that out, and you know, with a nice baguette, make yourself a wonderful beef dip.
I'm getting hungry.
I had turkey tacos for dinner. I beat probably soup yesterday though, so that makes up for it. So that's essentially the front of the animal. You can also order the brisket if you want it. Again, if you're getting a quarter of a cow, you might have to give something up to somebody else in order to get the whole brisket, because what you end up getting is, you know, we butcher the side, and then, you know, if there's 8 rib steaks, one guy gets 4, another girl gets 4. Right, that's how it gets split up. So you don't get all of the chuck or all of the tenderloin or all of the brisket. So if you want all of the brisket, you might have to give up something else.
Or just buy half.
Or you can just buy half the brisket. Brisket's
Yeah.
a bit of like, yeah. I mean, there's 2 parts of the brisket. There's the flat, which is sort of the leaner part, and then the decal, which is that really heavily marbled part. So, you know, if you're lucky, if you want the decal and you get it, great. You know,
I just went last weekend and it was awesome.
Nice. Yeah. I actually gave my brisket, so we split our side with our neighbors, and I gave them the brisket last year, so I'm still waiting for the invite to come over for dinner.
Yeah, it was a 16-hour process. But
Yeah, was it?
Oh.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
I know, they're challenging. Yeah, I mean,
It was breakfast for a week. But
yeah, I mean, I got up at 4 o'clock one morning to put on my brisket, and it still wasn't done.
I did my timer. I set my timer for 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And it would auto cook.
Oh, okay.
And then I came out and because it only auto cooks for 12 hours, so I didn't have the extra.
I have a charcoal smoker, so I literally was like 4 in the morning. I'm out there lighting my chimney starter. So, yeah. So one of these days I'll put it on at 11 at night, and I'll just set up a hammock and, you know, hopefully the smoke from the house burning down will wake me up. So yeah, that's, you know, out of the front of the animal. The other thing you can get is you can get the whole shank. If you want a big shank roast, that's another thing. I've got one I'm going to put on the smoker. You know, think of like lamb shank times 6, right? Your Captain Caveman, you know, monster beef shank. So it's another very impressive cut. So you can, you know, if you're getting a quarter, you would get a whole shank, because there's a front shank and a hind shank on each animal. So, but again, it's something you need to know what you're doing with it, right? A whole shank it's a long adventure, and you want to make sure that you're going to have the equipment to cook it properly and the time that you need.
It's amazing soup.
What's that?
I do my shanks as soup.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. I make a ragu usually.
Yeah.
So I'll braise them, and then I'll tear all the meat off of there. I'll scoop the marrow out of the bones, and then mix that in, and then, you know, serve that over some like homemade pasta or something. Amazing. So moving on to the back end of the animal now, the hind. On the right hand side there. So the rounds are basically the back leg of the animal. The back of the back leg. So the quadricep, the front of the back leg, is the sirloin tip. It's a big football-shaped roast. I prefer it as a roast or as stewing meat. You can get sirloin tip steaks. I'm not a big fan of them. I don't find them very tender. You know, I like my steaks to be tender enough where I can chew through them fairly easily. Sirloin tip, I've just never felt like I've had a good sirloin tip steak. So I usually get that as a roast. The round roasts, the biggest challenge with the rounds are the lack of connective tissue. So they're very lean. You know, so they're a good quick roast. You know, cook it up to medium rare, slice it thin, that kind of style. Not a great pot roast. Not a great, you know, put it in the oven for 4 or 5 hours. You're going to end up with a very tender, but it's going to be very, very dry. So you can enhance that with some sauces. You can mix it up into like a pulled beef to serve in tacos or something like that. But again, it's a bit of a, you know, it's better when it's cooked medium rare. Personally, I turn my rounds into jerky. So that jerky came off a round. I also make pastrami out of them. So I'll take the whole round, inject it, smoke it, or yeah, inject it, brine it, season it, smoke it, chill it, steam it, slice it, eat it. It's like a week long process for that, but it's pretty fun to do. Minute steaks are the ones that they're sort of the tenderized ones. So they run it through a machine called a delicator, which basically, you know, it's a round disc or round cylinders with teeth on them, and you push the steak through, and those teeth push into the meat, breaking apart the muscle fibers, making more tender. The chicken fried steak, if you've ever had or seen something like that, that's a minute steak. It's been tenderized and then breaded and fried and pan fried. If you like them, get them. You know, we had one of the gentlemen here yesterday said he ate so many of those growing up that even the thought of them makes him gag. So I never ate them. I've tried them once. There's so many tender pieces of meat on the animal to eat a steak. I'll just get a flap or a ribeye or a strip loin or something if I want a tender meat as a steak. I'm not going to tenderize a top cut and make it as a steak. So not a big fan of those, but again, that's your own personal preference. And the same thing with the round steaks. The round steaks, you know, they need help. They need marinating. You know, they're not a very tender cut. So if you don't mind to chew, you know, like if you're willing to give it 15 or 20 chews before you swallow, you know, go for it. But, you know, be aware that that's what that is. You know, I read this interesting book about steak and how most people they've actually done studies on how people eat steak, and most people want no more than 4 chews before they swallow, which is why things like the strip loin, the tenderloin, the ribeye are so popular, because you take a bite and it's jump, 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 and down the gullet it goes. So, you know, I'm not like that. I like to chew my meat a little bit more, but you know, by the time I'm at about 10, I think this has been in my mouth long enough. So, so yeah, as we'll work our way down. So, yeah, if you want the steaks, again, thickness, you know, my recommendation for a round steak would be 3/4 inch. You know, marinades don't generally penetrate that deep into the meat. So, you know, it's a bit of a myth that you can put something into marinade and it'll tenderize your meat. Well, it'll tenderize about 1/8 of an inch of that meat. And then the rest of it, you know, the molecules in your marinade are just too big to fit into the holes and displace the water in the muscle fibers. So you're not going to get a true fully tenderized piece of meat with any sort of marinade. So just keep that in mind when you're ordering. T-bone. Like I said before, I prefer my steaks boneless, but you know, we were in France or in Italy last summer, and we ordered in Florence and got that bistecca alla Fiorentina, the 2-inch thick T-bone that comes perfectly cooked on the outside and wonderfully bloody raw on the inside. And I destroyed it. Oh, I was proud of myself that night. Again, if you want them, get them. But keep in mind, as you go down here, we're going to hit tenderloin and New York steak. That's the same meat. So the T-bone is made up of the tenderloin on one side of the bone and your New York steak on the other side of the bone. So you get either T-bones or you get tenderloins and New York steaks. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're ordering as well. So back up to sirloin. The sirloin is what we refer to as the top sirloin. It's just the extension of the loin as it heads towards the tail of the animal. It comes as one whole piece of meat. Some producers or some processors will cut it into individual steaks. If you're going to order sirloin steaks, order the top sirloin cap. So write that down if you want to write that down. The top sirloin cap is the piece of meat that comes off of the top sirloin. In Argentina, it's known as the picanha. It's that piece of meat, if you've ever seen it, it's a wonderful piece with a big fat cap, and they curve it into a C, and then they spear it, and then they throw it over the fire. Beautiful piece of meat, wonderfully tender. It's worth ordering it separately because it is such a great grilling steak, and you would want to just cook that one separately. The rest of the sirloin will be cut into just regular sirloin steaks. But it's worth getting the caps seamed off separately. Tenderloin and New York steak, I've mentioned those briefly. Excuse me. Yeah, tenderloin, I would recommend nothing less than 2 inches per steak. Thin tenderloin steaks just are not, the tenderloin is a very, very lean cut, and it can get overcooked very quickly. So if it's a thin cut, if it's only 1 inch, you have to have really, really hot heat, and you have to get it on and off very, very quickly. A little bit thicker, a 2-inch steak, it's more impressive. It looks nicer on your plate. It gives you a little bit more forgiveness when you're cooking to make sure that you're not going to be overcooking it properly. And then the New York steaks, as I mentioned, it's a very popular cut, a very good cut, nice and tender, a nice fat cap on the outside, wonderful marbling throughout. It's a good, it is a very, very nice steak.
And the thickness on that?
I would recommend 1.5 inches for the ribeyes and for the strip loin steaks. I like a thick steak. I'm not a big fan of thin steaks. Again, I do a lot of cooking. A lot of my cooking is directly over charcoal, so I'm spending a lot of time tinkering on my grill, moving my steaks around to make sure that I'm not overcooking them. But if you're, you want to make sure that your steak is thick enough where if you walk away for a couple of minutes, you're not gonna ruin it. You're not gonna end up with a tough, overcooked steak. Sausages. If you like beef sausage, get beef sausage. You know, I'm fairly indifferent. I prefer pork sausage, but that's just me. I do a lot of stuff with ground meat, with ground beef, so that's where I usually want my beef trim going. Steaks per pack, again, is up to you. How many, you know, if you're a family of 4. If you're a family of 3, I would get 3 steaks per pack. If you're an even numbered family, I would go with 2 steaks per pack. And you can take up multiple packs, and then it's also easier to thaw. You know, a pack of 6 steaks is going to be packed about the size of a roast. You're going to have to take that and put it in the fridge probably about 4 or 5 days before you plan on eating it. So, you know, a thin pack with 2 steaks in it, you could take it out, you know, ideally 2 days before, put it in the fridge, and it'll be perfectly thawed by the time you're ready to cook it. Or the morning before the next day, kind of thing. That's usually what I do, is I take it out in the morning and then cook it the following evening.
So do you cook it straight from the fridge, or do you let it come to room temperature?
I cook mine straight from the fridge. So what I do with all of my steaks, I do a technique called dry brining. And so I salt my steak about 3, 4, 5 hours before I plan on eating it. Half a teaspoon of salt per pound of meat. It's essentially the same that you would salt it for flavor. Salt it both sides, put it on a plate, saran wrap on it, put it back in the fridge. What happens is that salt actually, so when salt dissolves in water, it breaks down into the sodium and chloride ions. And those ions are small enough to penetrate into the meat. And what happens with those ions is then when they're in the meat, they bind with the water in the meat, which then, when you cook it, that water doesn't escape. That molecule is now too big to escape. You end up with a juicier piece of meat. It's seasoned better. You have better flavor penetration through the whole thing. Cannot recommend it enough. Dry brining. I dry brine all my pork. I dry brine my chicken, turkey. Yeah, anything that you plan on putting on the grill. Any running animal. Dry brine fish doesn't work as well, but any animal with legs, you know, dry brine it. The bigger it is, the longer it takes. For my chickens, I dry brine them, you know, sometimes the night before. Leave it uncovered with the chicken in the fridge. The skin dries out, and then when you put it on, when you cook it, that skin just turns to like burnt paper. Like it's that crackling. It's so crispy and so thin and so delicious. So a wonderful technique that everybody should do, but very few people have heard of. So I hopefully try it, and you'll
What was that again?
dry brine it.
No, how much salt?
Half a teaspoon per pound of meat.
Dion,
Yeah.
what about, a lot of recommendations are to bring your meat to room temperature before you cook it.
Yeah, there's no real reason to. You know, the doneness of a piece of meat is purely a function of the temperature that it's at. So rare steak is 135 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Regardless of how it's cooked. It's all like that. That is the temperature of a rare steak. So a cold piece of meat is going to take longer to get to 130 than a warm piece of meat. Because I do, like I said, I do a lot of my cooking on either if I can, a charcoal grill. If I'm out of time, I'll do it on a gas grill. I want as much time on that grill as possible, so I get a really nice crust on the top of my meat, right? I'm not a grill mark guy, right? I'm not like, you know, I don't want X's on my meat. I want that entire surface to be brown and crispy. And the best technique for that is you just keep flipping. So when I cook my steaks, I will never leave them on one side for more than about 30 seconds. And I'll just keep flipping, and then, you know, 20, 30 seconds, just keep flipping it back, keep it over high heat. You get a really nice crust built on the entire surface of that piece of meat. And what happens is every time you flip it, that top surface starts to cool down. And it actually slows the cooking process throughout the whole piece of meat. So you get more of a very thin rim of crust and then an even cook throughout your entire steak. As opposed to some, you know, you might have seen some of the pictures where it's, you know, it's charred, it's gray, it grades into a little bit of pink, it grades into a better pink, the middle is rare, and then it grades into more of that gray. You get that sort of grayish band or gradient around the meat. I like to avoid that as much as I can, and if you keep flipping it, you can avoid that fairly well. So you'll only get maybe 1/8 of an inch of gray meat, and then the rest of that will be cooked, to whatever temperature you like. My number one piece of advice for anybody cooking steaks is a proper meat thermometer. Like the whole rare, medium rare, well done, or nobody can do that, right? Like unless it's that what was that book Outliers, where you need 3,000 hours.
10,000.
10,000 hours to be an expert at something. So do the math, right? It takes you 5 minutes to cook a steak. How many steaks? You gotta cook 160,000 steaks before you can be an expert, and you can just look at it and know when it's done. A proper digital thermometer. I use the Thermopen because it's very quick. You stick it in, it gives you a very quick reading of your steak, and you're never going to overcook a steak again. So the digital probe thermometer is the most important tool that you'll have in your kitchen for cooking meat. I cannot stress that enough. It's all about temperature. And it's the same thing with your brisket, right? Like you need to get that up to 205 because you need that collagen to convert into gelatin. And that doesn't finish happening until that beef gets up to 205 degrees. Or, you can sous vide it and you can cook it for, 72 hours. But when you're cooking something on a grill or smoke or in the oven, you have a limited time. You want to make sure you're getting it up to the proper temperature. And then you won't overcook your roast, your prime rib. Same thing. You want that cooked, really nicely. You don't want to overcook it. So a thermometer will definitely be your best friend in the kitchen. I've probably got like 15 digital thermometers. I've got for every piece of meat that I have, I think I've got separate ones. So. But yeah, there's huge. You don't have to buy an expensive one. Cheap ones work just as well. But yeah, they're very, very useful. So that's kind of my spiel. A couple of other steaks that you can get. A big favorite of mine is the flank steak. Flank steak comes off of the flank. So if you open up your book there, so it's the bottom, it's sort of the belly of the cow. There you should have a.
Oh, it's here.
Yeah, there we go. So there's the flank and the plate there. So flank steak is one of my favorite cuts. Holds up very nicely to marinades. It's literally looks like a paddle. If my hand had webbing and my hands were significantly bigger. It comes to a point, and then the meat grains work out from a center point. I marinated overnight, sometimes that long, maybe 4 or 5 hours, on the grill. Slice it across that grain. A great fajita steak. A great, sometimes just you slice it thin and you just eat it as a steak. Very, very nice piece of meat. You can also get skirt steaks. Similar texture to flank, but we're starting to get quite a bit more tough. So there's the inside skirt, the outside skirt, and the bavette are the three main steaks that you can get off of there. With those, you sort of have to know what you're getting into. It's a bit of a ropey steak. It's got very coarse muscle fibers, so it does very well with marinades, but it's got a great beefy flavor, but they're quite tough. So they need to be cooked properly, a medium rare, and then sliced thinly across the grain. Again, for somebody, if you want to chew your steak a little bit more, if you're willing to put in a little bit more effort, the flank, the skirts, and the bavette are a great steak. It's just you're getting a lot of really, really beefy flavor out of it, which is why we're here, right? We're here to get better tasting meat. At least that's why I'm here. I'm also here for all of the other stuff that they do as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my spiel here. Absolutely, I'll open up for questions.
What about phone?
Bones, if
Give
you
me
want.
bone.
What's that?
Give me the bone.